Welcome to the World Bank's Praxis discussion series. I'm Auskar Surbakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC, online and listening on radio, and everyone watching in Honiara, Dili and Port Moresby. The global landscape is changing. Extreme poverty has halved since 1990. The drivers of the world economy are now developing countries, and countries in the East Asia and Pacific region today account for 40% of global growth. But the reality is, we still live in a world that has more than 1 billion people living in absolute poverty. Meanwhile, threats from climate change, natural disasters, and volatile food prices loom large for many countries, particularly small island states in the Pacific. So what is the role of aid in this changing world? And with the 2015 deadline for the UN Millennium Development Goals edging closer, what needs to be done to meet those targets? How do we ensure aid is effective and that it reaches the poorest people? To discuss these issues, we're joined by Dr. Jimmie Rodgers from the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, Margaret Reid, who sat on the panel of Australia's independent review of aid effectiveness, and Axel van Trotsenburg, the World Bank's Vice President for East Asia and the Pacific. Thank you all for joining us. Okay. Firstly, Axel, if I could ask you, East Asia is now described as the engine of global growth. Is aid still relevant in this climate?
Indeed, East Asia is the engine of growth in the world and has, as a consequence, produced spectacular reduction in poverty rates. In the last 10 years, people living on less than $2 a day in this region have fallen from about 50% to 25%. But this 25% represents still almost 500 million people. So yes, growth has been key. At the same time, the job has not been done completely, and we need to continue, and not forgetting that still almost 500 million people need to be lifted out of poverty permanently.
Even in countries like India and China that are fast becoming economic superpowers, do we still need to give aid to these countries?
In these two countries, you need to look. You mentioned the absolute poor. In fact, in India and in China, half of the absolute poor are living. And yes, China and India are doing most themselves, relying on their own domestic resources. But in countries like India, small amounts of aid can still make a big difference in critical areas where they can draw on international best practice and international cooperation. So we should not forget that these countries do 99% of the job themselves. The less than 1% where they are asking international expertise, I think are good investments.
Margaret, can I ask you, we have all of these developing countries now, I guess, getting themselves out of poverty with the help of international donors as well as their own economies. And you've reviewed Australia's aid program quite extensively. Does the rise of countries like India and China, does it make aid a harder sell to people in countries like Australia?
I think it's more difficult if we were giving aid to China and India, and we're not doing that anymore. There may be Australian money spent in India and China through our contributions to the World Bank, and that's quite acceptable. But I think the focus of our aid needs to be on our more immediate area where there are many of the poor that Axel has referred to within our own region. There's plenty of work to be done.
And is it right for people in the developed world, in ordinary taxpayers and citizens, to question where aid money is going and why it's going to countries that are seemingly becoming wealthier?
Oh, absolutely. I think the success of the aid program has to be because the Australian people want an aid program and want to be involved. And I think we have a pretty well bipartisan approach to aid in that sense. But they're entitled to know what we're doing, where we're doing it, and why we're doing it to maintain that level of support, both for the government programs, because, I mean, taxpayers' money comes out of the pockets of Australian individuals, it's not some other magic source, and also to make sure that the money given by Australians to the incredible agencies we have here, the NGOs in Australia, is not in any way damaged. They're a very important part of it. In my view, they are a very important part of our aid program and the sort of the image of Australia in the aid sector.
And Dr. Jimmie Rodgers, the world at the moment is consumed with how East Asia is developing, how these countries are getting wealthier and developing in their own right. But of course we can't forget about the Pacific Island states as well, which you're concerned with. So in that context, are you concerned that countries in the Pacific are being left behind?
That is a fear that happens in Pacific Island countries, particularly when we look at putting Pacific together with Asia. And Asia-Pacific is sort of the common terminology, and of course when you look at 40% growth, it's all Asia. The picture's the reverse in the Pacific. The resource base is very small, it's uneven distribution of natural and human resources, and we fight against the tide, for instance, in trying to raise the issue of vulnerability in Pacific Island countries of areas that need to be addressed. So I think that is a real concern. At the global level, we have a very small voice, and it's very difficult to shape the international agenda. And I think that's another area where some of the support given to Pacific countries are not necessarily on money terms or aid. I think it is more advocacy for the differences and the vulnerability for some of these countries who don't have a voice at the international setting. And I think we'll sort of discuss some of that in the issues to do with MDGs.
Axel, in light of the changing world landscape, how much more challenging is it for a development institution like the World Bank to remain relevant?
Well, I think to be relevant is that you are going with the times, that you remain dynamic, that you are looking at the new challenges. So you see also within the World Bank program, we have changed over time our programs, and depending what the new challenges are, we are seeing clearly new emerging challenges. We were just talking about the Pacific Islands. It is not only the need for international community to stay committed there, but also to recognize that natural disasters and climate change have huge impacts on the Pacific Islands, or they will have huge impacts on Vietnam and other countries in this region. And this is costing these countries 1, 2 or more percentage points of GDP per year. So, and these are not things they created themselves, but this is climate change created somewhere else. So here, international institutions need to stand by these countries and see how we can best help through adaptation measures, but also being advocacies for them and adding voice in a world where sometimes the smaller countries have little voice in international fora, and here certainly the World Bank can be very helpful.
And I just want to ask you about China, and I want to be careful about not dwelling too much on one particular country, but we know that it's the world's second largest economy. It overtook Japan. It's some say it's on track to becoming the world's #1 economy within 20 years, which is really a short amount of time. Why is the World Bank still focused or still giving money to a country like China?
This is still a lower middle income country. The money that this country is getting is fairly small. And what we are also seeing is this country is entering what I would say a gray zone, which many other OECD countries were in the 1960s. Take Japan. In the early 60s, they started giving to the World Bank's Fund for the Poorest money, while receiving also from the World Bank loans. This was not only Japan, this were many European countries like in Finland. What is China doing? They are getting some loans from the bank, but they are increasingly stepping up their participation in, for example, the Fund for the Poorest countries. In our latest replenishment, they went from 30 million to $2.35 billion. So they are stepping up, and I think we should welcome that they are also joining this struggle against poverty on a worldwide scale. And the World Bank believes that this is the right development. In the overall context, if there is a fairly modest program with the World Bank on projects, that helps also the international learning. These are not major programs that shape ultimately the financial direction of China.
And Jimmie, what do you think about when you hear these countries still receiving aid, countries that are now economic powers receiving aid? Would you prefer to see those efforts focused on, say, countries in the Pacific instead?
The way we see it is it's not a straight response that if you receive aid, you're not a superpower or you're not an economy. I think there is a lot more dictating how aid is given, and you always look at the balance. And for us, it's more a question of the net positives that we see. So for Australia, for instance, that the major donors to the Pacific island countries and regional organizations, and still provide aid to countries like Indonesia, that the resource rich, we see that as a balance between supporting those that those countries are not even focusing on. And if you look at Indonesia, for instance, there's a quite big proportion of Indonesian people that on the very poor that are not being looked after by their governments, and therefore some of the people need to come and support that. But I think in addition to that, the aid really need to also focus on not just lifting people up, it also needs to focus on how to sustain an approach that over time countries, including those from the Pacific, should actually start to build up their own mechanisms to sustain whatever aid has provided, to sustain it beyond the time when aid finishes. And I think the real question is, how do we actually sustain the good things that aid are delivering to people in the Pacific by involving those governments to take the responsibility and the initiatives within the constraints of their resources to then move forward with that. And I think I used the last time an example that just brings out to me the issues. Solomon Islands, I think, is a country that I used. And they are the third largest in the Pacific now in terms of population, second largest in land area, but their total national budget in quantum terms is approximately $500 million Australian dollars. And I used the example that $500 million Australian dollars for a population of 650,000 people is probably about the same budget as the Prince of Wales Hospital operates in a year. And I think it's very important when we look at countries and resources that we start to contextualize right down to the grassroots, because that's when we start to look at solutions on the long term, because there's no one size fits all.
By the way, China doesn't get aid. They receive market-based loans. They no longer get actually aid for most countries, nor from the World Bank.
Okay. I'd like to now talk about this idea of so-called fragile states, and it's estimated by 2015, which is also the deadline for the UN Millennium Development Goals to be reached. It's estimated by that time half of the world's poor will be living in fragile states. Axel, what sort of a challenge does this I guess, pose to an organisation like the World Bank dealing with fragile states? Well,
it is not only a challenge for the World Bank, it is a challenge for the whole international community that we cannot fail fragile and conflict-affected states. Unfortunately, their number have been increasing. I think that there is a clear emphasis now, certainly in the World Bank, but also in other organizations, that we have to sharply focus on this, increase the resources, but also be on the ground and help these countries get their economies going, but also deal with poverty issues and the whole range of development challenges. I think there is a lot of commitment on this. What we need to do is, it's about resources, but it is also long-term commitment. We should not come and fly in and fly out and believe that you can solve this quickly. This requires that, unfortunately, things have happened that create structural fragility, vulnerabilities, and what the international community has to do is long-term commitment. This comes also to your original question, is there still relevance? There is relevance for development aid. These countries require long-term commitment, be it at the bilateral level, be it at the multilateral level, like organizations of the World Bank.
Okay, Margaret, I want to ask you in a moment about what works in terms of aid in these sort of countries. But before we get to that, Jimmie, what is a fragile state? Because it isn't just a country that's emerged out of conflict, is it?
I think it's very important to broaden the definition of fragile states. You know, if we limit it to countries that come out of conflict, then it's like a funnel that we're actually going down to the focus. And in theory, that then means that you're not fragile unless you have had a conflict. And let's also remember some of these conflicts are driven from outside the country. So which means that we actually contribute to that country becoming a fragile state, and that's a different discussion. But coming from a Pacific setting, I think we have to look at it from the perspective of a number of parameters. Firstly, the geographical. Pacific Island countries, 17 of them, you put all of them together. These are all the Polynesian countries and all the Micronesian countries. You put all of them together, they still have a total land area less than that of Vanuatu. And so this, when you actually look at resource base in the Pacific, 98% is in 5 Melanesian countries. So that's already in itself saying something what happens 50 years from now. The other is the human resource capacity. Does the country actually have enough human resource expertise to drive its own development agenda, including developing plans so that initiatives can be country-led and country-based? The third is the financial resources. More than half Pacific Island countries going long-term because of their natural geographical limitations are not going to be able to provide products for export. And I think it's very important in that context that many of these countries will rely on aid going into the long term, which then raises the question of what is the purpose for aid, and should aid be the subject for discussion in countries that do not have enough capacity to generate funds over the long term? Or should we start thinking about a realization that for many of these countries in the Pacific that cannot themselves generate resources are looked upon as more countries that are partners who will require assistance in the long term. So it's not aid for 2 or 3 years. It's not a bilateral partnership agreement over 5 years that says you do this before we do that. I think it's more an issue of really acknowledging what are the key challenges, us answering the question, can they generate resources to support themselves over the long term? And if the answer obviously is no, then the modality should go into a partnership that says these countries will need a longer term, 20, 30, 40 years partnership program that is based on mutual support and mutual recognition that they will continue to require support.
Margaret, given that half of the world's poor will be living in fragile states, not only in the Pacific but elsewhere in the world, how can aid be delivered effectively in these types of environments?
I think the important thing is to recognise that some fragile states are fragile right now because of particular things that may have happened. You need not necessarily regard them as fragile forever, and that's one category. There are some nearer to us that probably will always be fragile, and hopefully one day we might find a nicer little word to refer to them. If it's a very small population, if they really have almost no natural resources, it is very difficult for them to become self-sufficient. And we want a partnership arrangement with those that recognises our responsibility as neighbours to be involved with them, but maintains their self-respect in terms of being a self-governing country, doing for themselves what they are able to do, sort of with our assistance. And it's not a question of one model for all fragile states. Some of them need support. I mean, some of these countries in the Pacific, even if they have good resources, it's so small that in a sense you can't really help them get it to market in any event. I can recall the first time I ever went to Vanuatu, a long time ago, I ate the best veal I had ever eaten in my life, and my natural reaction to this was, this place should be producing veal and getting it out to the world. Well, there are a few problems with that. One is the cost of an abattoir which would be suitable for it, but then the amount of veal available would be such that it probably may not be economic to even contemplate that. Having produced suitable veal for the world, how are you going to get it there? Now, that's just a little example of something. you know, how can you help people get there? There are not even the little tramp steamers moving around the Pacific that there were sort of 100 years ago that can take things from one marketplace to another. Big ships can't get into some of them. So you need a special protocol of a relationship between Australia and some of these countries that are entitled to stay where they are, maintain their culture and live with self-respect, but have more than they are able to produce themselves.
And can I ask you about Australia's aid program, which you have reviewed extensively? What makes for good aid? Is Australia on the right track? Because we know that the government has pledged to increase its aid budget. It wants to have a much more far-reaching aid program, reaching the likes of the Horn of Africa. Is this the right approach for the Australian government?
The right approach to aid is to make sure that the money is being of value to those who are really poor and living in poverty. It is not there to prop up governments. It is not there for governments. You may spend some of it through a local government if it's a government that you regard as satisfactory for the purpose, but you do it through whatever means, whatever partnership, whatever relationship you can, but the purpose of it has to be that those living in poverty will be better off. It may be a water plant, it may be a road which enables a group somewhere to get their products more easily to market and benefit from that. There's not one particular aid program that is appropriate, but the focus must always be on the fact that we are talking about human beings, individuals who are living in poverty.
And Axel, there's been a lot of talk about Australia increasing its global profile. It's described itself as a middle power. It now has a seat on the UN Security Council, and as I mentioned, it's pledging to increase its aid budget. How important is Australia's relationship with the World Bank in that context?
I would say very important. For our Fund for the Poorest Countries, we have 52 countries joining in that effort. We mobilized last time around about $50 billion. And Australia made a very, very significant contribution. What makes the role of Australia important is not only the money, but it are also the ideas you bring in it. It also brings Australia has been a very strong advocate for support to the Pacific Islands. It has been a strong supporter in cutting at issues from gender to the whole results frameworks. So what you are getting in this kind of replenishment negotiation, you need that voice. There are very large players and there are mid-sized players. And the mid-sized players help shape the agenda. And I think, therefore, the role of Australia has been very much appreciated by the bank. Is certainly in the last time that I was involved in with the last round, it was certainly that Australia that helped shape the overarching theme of it. It was on the results and also on focus on the Pacific Islands, and they were very, very successful.
And can we discuss I guess, the global view of aid, because we know that some countries are more generous than others. The example that's always pointed out are Scandinavian countries who develop more of their GDP to aid programs. What would you like to see happen with commitments from different countries? Does it need to be drastically increased? Are we on the right track, or what needs to happen, do you think, on a global level?
Well, you know, we are looking at a decade past where there was enormous energy for the Millennium Development Goals. It culminated in the Glen Eagle Summit in 2005. But clearly that the global financial crisis has had an enormous impact, that countries have faced serious fiscal problems. And what you're now seeing is a differentiated picture. You see a differentiated picture that some cannot just do it because of their fiscal constraint. A good example are Southern European countries. You see also a lot of questioning in countries about development aid, and there is sometimes a misunderstanding what aid can achieve. And I think here the emphasis to show the results, how countries have translated money into schools and outcomes that kids have actually graduated, is important to show. What we are making at the bank the case is that people need to stay engaged. There is an enormous job to be done at the country level, but also looking at global public goods, from health challenges to climate change. There we need the international community to take together. We should also not forget, the industrialized world is not like that we are giving enormous amounts. From every $100 on average in the industrialized world, 30 cents are being provided. And a lot is plowed back through procurement to this country. So, I mean, it is an amount, it is a good investment, and if you are looking how much we have been over the decades been able to help reduce poverty with these countries, then I think we need to continue to do so.
But the amount of aid is significant, but not nearly as significant as how it's spent. It is so easy to get rid of money. You can spend it, you know, you can have a budget, you can get rid of it easily. But if none of it's effective, you might as well not have spent it in the first place. So effectiveness of the program has to have a very high priority, along with the concept of the amount of money being spent. But effectiveness is important.
Jimmie, on that note, in terms of the aims of aid, often critics say a lot of aid has a short-term agenda. They've described it as development fads. From your experience, is this the case? Are some programs too focused on short-term outcomes rather than long-term solutions?
I think the nature of programming aid is the issue. I think aid in itself is a very good mechanism to help countries' development agendas. And for some of the countries, development priorities take more than the normal time frame in which aid is provided. And I think the question, as I've sort of hinted at before, is really looking at what are the key development priorities that the recipients of aid, and I'm going back to the Pacific, what are the key development priorities these countries would like to achieve? How do they see themselves in 20 years' time? Would they on their own steam be able to get there? And if the answer obviously is not that they need continued support, then the modality of aid, I think, needs to be modified. So rather than every 3 years, it needs to go into a slightly different modality of partnership aimed at milestones that will be achieved to measure progress. And I think that kind of program is more useful for smaller Pacific Island countries that don't have enough people power anyway to actually continually look forward and look backwards and review things going on, rather than moving on milestones to move forward. So I think that is probably a practice in aid. The other aspect of aid, I think, it's very easy to say it hasn't made any difference. When you look at specific examples, and I think a good one to pick would be the decrease in malaria in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, where 10 years ago, in Solomon Islands, 500 people per 1,000 population have malaria. Now it's down to 50. In Vanuatu it was 200 10 years ago. Now it's down to 20. So that is effectively the impact of assistance coming to those two countries, reducing what is the biggest killer in those two countries and helping people achieve livelihoods. But malaria will continue. And I think there are two issues that need to be looked at. It's not just continuing aid, but the role the governments take to actually ensure that the impact of the development assistance is built into their own sustainability programs. So I think there is a balance there between continuing the aid flow through a different modality, as well as increasing the country's own commitment to make sure that the benefits achieved through aid are sustained.
Before we throw open to questions, I just want to, I guess, pose a broad question about aid. Does it work? Is there any evidence to link it to a reduction in poverty, to progress in health and education in countries that need it?
Sometimes we are forgetting that actually aid can work and has good results. If you look about Asia, there was a book in the 1960s by Nobel Prize winner Gunnar Myrdal. And he wrote Asian Drama and described how every year these countries were in a desperate state of poverty and a cycle they would not get out. Poverty was at the 80% level through South and Southeast Asia. And basically people were not convinced this. Actually, this was one of the reasons why actually international community started this fund for the poorest country in 1960. And in the 1960s, India got 45% of it. The Green Revolution was financed with it. The White Revolution, I never knew what the White Revolution was. The whole dairy industry in India was financed with the World Bank. And what you are seeing is spectacular poverty reduction. Countries when we started working in the 1960s were affected by 70 to 80% of poverty. Today, it is less than 40%, and we have to do more. Countries like Korea, like China, but also like Colombia or Turkey got all this type of money and now now in middle income status and on their own. So I think you can see a lot of cases. Now people then say, well, what about Africa? Well, in Africa, the starting conditions were extremely difficult. 50 years ago, when many of these countries became independent, maybe only 10 or less % of the kids could go to school. Today you are at the 90%. Is it 100? It's still not at 100%, but it is enormous progress. And what you have to see is that over time we have been able to support this. But what I said at the very beginning, the job has not been done. And then what we have also to recognize that where mistakes are being made, we have to address it. Because as Margaret said, this is taxpayers' money. We have an obligation to work that scares $8 to the maximum. And that requires results, very clear frameworks, how we make this happen. And I think here, be it on the bilateral level, but also at the multilateral level, a lot of progress has been made in making these programs much more results-oriented and also accountable.
Okay, now it's time to questions, and a reminder to people watching that you can submit your questions as well from where you are. But firstly, can I ask for any questions in Sydney? Yes, sir.
Michael Hutak from the Asian Development Bank. Just in relation to the MDGs, we don't hear a lot about MDG 8, the Partnership for Development. I wonder if you have any views on how we're going in that in the Pacific, and how we can get the aid and donor community to work better with the private sector to get sustainable economic growth to alleviate poverty?
I think that what you are seeing actually, this is part and parcel, I think, of the ongoing debate. One doesn't look anymore at only a multilateral entity like the World Bank or a bilateral aid agency. You need to look at across the whole spectrum how we all together can make a difference, and that includes the private sector. We see many challenges that cannot be met only with public resources. So we need to have the private sector in it. That means we need to look at enabling environments. Here we can work with governments to improve the investment climate, and particularly with a view ultimately of creating jobs there. And I think that is what I think many of us are doing, is that creating jobs is an enormous challenge. But it is not only a challenge in developing countries, it's also in developed countries. I think there we are in it. I think also on partnership, I think there is a lot more cooperation and coordination across the spectrum. Again, the challenge is that we need to make it simpler and more streamlined, and that is a work in progress. I think we need to always to stay self-critical, that one shouldn't only celebrate all the successes, but what are the next steps. And for example, in the Pacific Islands also, how we can work across the spectrum. I would say, for example, with the Asian Development Bank, we have a lot of offices together now. We work with the EU together, a strong partnership with Australia, and ultimately what binds us together is our desire to have differences on the ground in these countries, and I think that should be our focus in this. And but I think there I've been more encouraged about the general wish. I came just back from Myanmar. It's the same as a new country starting, and here is indeed the whole donor community very, very firm on how we all work together to make a difference.
We have a question here from Richard Sanderson in Dili, directed to you, Margaret. What are the key areas to measure the effectiveness of aid?
Well, those coming out of poverty, but I think also one of the aspects of it all I look at is the status of women in the countries that we're talking about. Improving all sorts of things is important, but to me, if you're not improving the status of women in a country, then you're not actually achieving a lot, because that'll make a difference to the way the children are brought up and the opportunities that they have. So I put a fair emphasis personally on status of women in a country.
And of course you were Australia's first female president of the Senate as well, so it's quite relevant, isn't it?
Not sure that I see that that's quite relevant.
It's interesting to point out.
But I just think really the status of women in a community is very crucial.
Mm.
The World Bank did a major report on gender, and we call this smart economics by empowering women in the process. There's a long way to go, and I think what we need to focus on is to provide all the opportunities for girls, but also women, and also looking at women's rights, as well as looking at all the things where it would go wrong, particularly domestic violence. What we are seeing in many countries is a major issue, and so I think this has to be an integral part of the development agenda as we go forward.
If I just put a specific spin on the women, it's also an area that is quite interesting, because culture plays a huge role on the perception of women right from the beginning. So I guess we are looking at an area where there's already a challenge for us to address, and the question I continue to raise is, why is it that the status of women have continued to be the same despite millions of dollars poured into women empowerment? And I think the issue there comes back to the modality of the approach might be different, and the issue there is not always targeting women, because when you go to a Melanesian culture, it is the men that you need to target. And I think we need to broaden the scope of agenda to try and work from the base. And so, that's probably the best way of moving forward. When we look at school enrollments in the Pacific, Polynesian countries are way ahead in school enrollments. They're almost reaching 100%, almost 100% boys and girls. Melanesian countries, again, are way back, in particular Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, with larger populations. Micronesia, there is a mixed picture. There's still a lot to do, and I think I agree with Margaret that status of women, status of children become quite important measures on aid effectiveness.
If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, I think it was about 8 of them are specifically female related or a heavily component in it. So in the end, when we do look at the Millennium Development Goals, that'll be a very important aspect of assessing how we've done over the last 10 years.
Do we have another question from Sydney? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Anna Whelan from University of New South Wales, adjunct. I think just picking up on the women's empowerment question, I've just come back from Bougainville recently, and I think one of the things that struck me was that in the remote villages, women were still walking miles to get water. So our aid programs might be having women's empowerment programs, but if you're still walking miles to water to gather water, you don't have safe sanitation, you've still got the basics you have to deal with. My big question to all of you is, what are we doing about adolescents and young people in the Pacific in particular, where the proportion is very high? Young people have aspirations, they see the world around them through their technologies, and yet the realities in their own countries are not there that can meet those aspirations. I think that's a critical question for our development and aid agenda to focus on.
Well, it is, and Dr. Rodgers has in a sense referred to that, but the question of the status of women not being just the status of women on their own, it has to involve the men in the communities taking a different attitude towards it, and children will benefit from that in the end. They must have schools to go to. You must have schools with toilets so girls will go to school. There are some quite fundamental issues. But it really, the question of the status of women really is the health of the whole community. And making a difference to the way men look at it will make a difference then to the opportunities for young people. And in some of the small countries, the idea of getting an education, leaving home and going to another country to work and sending remittances will remain part of their life. To me, it's not a lifestyle that I would, hope to be involved in a sense. One likes to feel that your family is more accessible. But in many cases, the concept of remittances and people being able to be educated and go to another place and earn money which they can use to support their older relatives is an important part of it. But it's the whole community that has to have an opportunity to grow.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, because if you were to look at that as a proportion of population, and again I go back to the most populous Pacific countries, you're talking about in Papua New Guinea almost 2 million people in there. Solomon Islands, you're talking about close to 200,000. And I think if we were to look back 30 years, the kind of challenges in Port Moresby, Honiara, were not really there about 30, 40 years ago, when there were not too many young unemployed people coming into the cities and urbanize the places. The worrying thing for me looking forward into the next 30 years is that population will almost double. The jobs are not going to come up. There's going to be more frustration. The question really is, at least in the Pacific setting, if we do not have mechanisms now to address the current issues, how many more countries will have similar experiences going forward in about 30, 40 years? And really, these are the key questions, I think, that policymakers, these are not really development partner questions, they can be posed, but policymakers at national level really need to take a crunch and say, look, our population is going to double in about 30, 40 years' time. We're going to have twice as much of this challenge. What are we going to do now? How do we invest to go forward? Use that agenda then to have sensible discussions with partners to say, well, really, you're helping us in this area, but if you want to focus on something that will give us a good outcome in 40 years, how about working with us through this agenda? Because really, the human face, if we don't address it now, I think that is going to be the big challenge coming up.
The bank is actually supporting a lot of community-driven development projects, where you actually would like to capture the demand from the basis, if you wish. And there you are seeing a lot of water-related projects, but precisely of the reasons you'd say that a lot of women have to walk miles to get potable water. I've seen it myself firsthand last year in Nepal, where we had projects where you bring potable water. It changes completely the life of women. It gives them the opportunity to deal with their children. So you give them a different chance on this. Now, ultimately, when you then say about adolescents, I think you will need to look at education. And then across the whole spectrum, very often in the development debate is, well, we're looking at primary education. Well, we are emphasizing you need to look almost at primary school education, then primary, secondary, and beyond that. And I think that whole spectrum has to be better covered on this. Secondly, I think you need to look at growth prospects of an economy. So we often do this in our analytical work, but also our financial support work, how you actually look to unleash higher growth. And that has to go with the private sector, because there ultimately most of the jobs can be created. And if we don't have that enabling environment as well, then you are limited. So we see this not in a single issue campaign, but in a holistic way, where we will need to have that conversation on the medium and long term.
I sort of just want to pick up there, because I agree with everything that Axel has said, but this comes back to one of the key differences about the Pacific, because there are at least 7 or 8 Pacific countries that you would say have no private sector, or very little private sector. Therefore, the engine room for development has to be private sector plus, where there is no private sector, what are the options? And I think, so just to point out that, private sector is the main engine in the Pacific, it is, but we've got to be conscious that some of these countries, by nature of their vulnerabilities and size, just don't have one that can cater.
We have a question from Margaret in Papua New Guinea, who asks, Pacific Islands are prone to national disasters. How can countries in that region become self-sufficient when they're endlessly dealing with natural disasters?
There is right now, I think, there are disasters that may have been homemade, that maybe certain things have been neglected. I think increasingly the problems are related to climate change. And there the tragedy is we don't have an answer because we haven't any agreements on a major attack on the climate change. What we have been doing is in the bank is that we are providing support to a crisis response window. We have different interruptions, but these are all, if you wish, spot interventions. If in Samoa a tsunami hits, we all are ready. So the question is, how many other investments can we undertake? And there the problem is that often the resources have been limited. And I think therefore we need to link also the development agenda increasingly to the climate change agenda. You cannot delink this. And as long as we have not a global deal on climate change, I think countries in the Pacific will be challenged.
Well, you're looking, can I just add to the climate change subject, because one of the important things is not to predefine what climate change is. One of the things we're facing in the Pacific is when we talk about agriculture, it's not climate change. When we talk about forestry, how does this link to climate change? And I think it's very important when we have the deal that the areas of intervention to mitigate against or adapt to climate change are in fact in the sectors. In the atoll island countries, for instance, we're working on climate tolerant seeds that can survive salt intrusion, but it's not seen as climate change adaptation. So I think it's very important that we're not sort of driven by climate change as the topic without looking further down to say, well, this is actually how you then adapt against it, and I think that's important. The other point to make is that Pacific countries in particular, they don't need a disaster to be vulnerable. They are already vulnerable. And I think the issue there for these countries is understanding the risk. I think that is the most important thing right up front. Know what the risks are, because then you can try to adapt and manage the risks. And I think the big part of managing climate change starts with understanding what are the risks climate change gives, how do we then adapt in our setting, and how do we respond to the bigger things like earthquakes and tsunami. If we're in a country that's only 1.5 meters above sea level, as some of the Pacific countries are, then you don't want to think about tsunamis, because if it comes, there's no place to hide. So I think the realities also need to come into the debate on how do these countries cope. But I think the most important thing up front is know the risks and then know how to then mitigate against them.
We have a question here from Irene Scott in Honiara. And it's directed to the panel. When the Millennium Development Goals expire, what will the aid community look towards to next? Can a new set of goals have the same impact?
There is an ongoing discussion within the United Nations on the post-2015 goals. What the bank stresses is we are in 2013. So I think while we have made progress, there are still many things to be done. So I think that rather to say, okay, we need to look into the future, but we would certainly want to make the plea that we need to keep the momentum. And that momentum is in many areas, like in poverty reduction, we have made good progress. But you were just mentioning about the other MDGs. Think of maternal mortality. That is one where we have collectively failed. there the reduction isn't it. So we need to do more, and we need to keep that momentum. I don't think that we can stop by 2015 and say, oh well, we look at something else. This will need to continue. Where a lot of discussions are being directed also at sustainable indicators, we need a sustainable Earth. So we need also not only to look at the indicators we have already targeted, but we need also look at sustainability, and that comes out the Rio +20 conference. So I think there will be a lot. My plea is really that the international community doesn't get too self-centered when there is a fiscal crisis, and it is serious. We need to deal with this, but we should not forget that there is international solidarity, and that should not be limited only to one's own country, but we need to think globally about this.
When you get to 2015 and look at it, I think it's important to be positive about what has been achieved over 10 years, and there will be a great deal that has been achieved. There will be some areas where we've done less than we would have liked. I think there'll be almost no change to what the goals are for this planet. You may add some, you may tweak it a bit, and that's probably not terribly relevant one way or another. The goals that we're aiming to achieve for the poorest people of the world are really still the same. As I said, let's be pleased about what has been achieved, perhaps look at why we didn't do better than we did. Don't be too negative about it all, but press on to see that we actually achieve the goals sometime rather than abandon them.
Do we have a question from the audience in Sydney?
Ian Savrimutu from the University of Western Sydney. This goes back to the point about governments, both developed and developing, struggling to create jobs for the people. To what extent are the projects, aid-related projects, related to preventing the rural-urban migration, which brings about more problems for developing countries specifically when it comes to young people or everyone else looking for a job?
Well, you know, you see that actually worldwide, in industrialized countries elsewhere, there have been enormous urbanization, also like in China. That doesn't mean that that is necessarily negative. It depends on how all these trends or migration trends are managed and what are the consequences on this. I think then also with the aid part in this is it depends how important that is in a country. If it is marginal, I don't think that it will make a difference. If it is a major, meaning that aid is enormous importance, then you will have to look at it. Usually what in our project, we look at the impact these projects have, not only on the project itself, but also what the externalities are, and then you need to look, if there is a risk, how you mitigate against this.
I was also going to say that I guess it really depends on the focus of where the aid is applied at a country level. And if, like in some Pacific countries, quite a bit of the focus is in the urban capital, then that creates that issue. But if the aid application is actually right across some of these countries, building up rural sector livelihoods, then it's less of a problem. So I guess I come back to the issue of planning the investment of aid by countries and partners together to try and use a preventive, proactive approach.
Well, I'll ask a question from East Timor now. It's from Vanuatu, from the Ministry of Finance in Dili. What reform needs to take place so that aid can show its full potential in overcoming poverty?
It is not for an aid agency to determine the reform agenda. I think if that happens, we are on the road to failure. The only programs that can be successful are those that are formulated by the government or by the country and are owned by the country. We as an international community, it is certainly for the multilateral, but I would also argue for bilateral donors, we can only be complementary forces in that effort. If that is the other way round, I would be very critical of any of those. So I would turn this around. It is how strong is a reform program as perceived by the people in a country that they can support, and then they can actually ask how the international community best can complement those efforts, but not the other way around.
It has to be what is wanted in the country to which aid's being given. It's not what we want to do for somebody. That is not the question at all. It is what is necessary in that country that we might contribute to, or that we have the expertise to make happen for them. That is very important, and I think I agree. If we are trying to impose things, then you're not going to achieve much at all.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's the same question I posed before, that each country really need to answer the question, where do they want to be, say 10 years from now, and where are they now, and how do they get there? They need to drive that agenda, they need to set the milestones, and then talk sensibly with partners to help them get there.
And on that note, that brings us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our panellists, Dr. Jimmie Rodgers, Margaret Reid and Axel von Trotsenburg. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of our other Praxis discussions at www.worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Auskar Surbakti, and thanks for joining us.